running is a religious experience, but the way that runners, or in this case, running companies, describe that experience offers us another intersection of religion and pop culture, this time through the use of religion or religious language in pop culture. On January 1st, 2023, a running company called Tracksmith released a film about an hour and 23 minutes. There will be a link to the film at the end of this video. Now, this film is my pop culture artifact, and the film is quite popular. It's garnered 72,000 views since its release. Now, the film is shot from a truck driving in front of, alongside, and behind a woman as she completes a weekly long run in Rollinsville, Colorado. Now, there are two questions that are important for scholars of religion to consider. Now, the first is the act of running as a religious experience itself. And here, much has been written by scholars of religion, and so I want to take a look at 3 examples of scholars of religion writing about the connection between running and religion. So first we have Jordan Ballard, who's writing about running and its relationship to his faith. For Ballard, running, and he's talking about running much more as being a runner than an individual run. But for Ballard, being a runner, i.e. running, is a really good image of the Christian life. And we'll come back to this kind of use of Christian language to describe being a runner or running. Now, I want to move into 2 examples that are more kind of methodological in focus. The first is Charles Edgley. He did a study in 1984 about the motives for runners. Why do they run? And what he concludes at the end of his study is that, okay, running is a religion, but for Edgley, it's all about the individual for 3 reasons. First, it could be based on spiritual reasons, or for bodily health, or for personal appearance. And we're going to come back to this third example, or to this third motive, personal appearance, in a little bit. But for Edgley, running may be a religion, but that religion is, quote, based on an individual rather than a social ethic. And this is actually something that Tracksmith is going to try to push back on with their film. We'll get to that in a minute. But the final example, actually, Thomas Kirsten actually kind of critiques Edgley's work. Kirsten's writing about running and mysticism, the mystical experience of running, and he kind of critiques these quantitative studies to describe the motives for runners. Kirsten wants more in-depth analysis on fewer examples. He opts for interviews, but for Tracksmith, they release an article alongside this film that gives us some of the same insights that an in-depth interview like Kirsten wants us to do would give us. So we're able to kind of examine the motivations behind this project and how Tracksmith and the athlete and filmmaker involved in the project not only envisioned the project, but also the experience of the run which they were documenting. So I want to focus on this other question for scholars of religion, which is, okay, if running is a religious experience, right? If we grant that premise, then how do we put words to that? How do runners explain that experience, what they're doing? Now, the article that Tracksmith releases along with this film really gives us some insight, and it starts right with the title. So the title of the film is called Church of the Long Run. It's directed by Emily May, but the title, Church of the Long Run, is really kind of the first indication of religious language, the first instance of religious language in Tracksmith's project. Now, the first paragraph of this article drastically expands the use of religious language. It's not just the word church in the title. Here we see the fact that long runs happen on the same day as church, on Sundays often. We also see the words congregation, penance, ritual, communion, hypnotic, meditative, altar, deliverance, and finally they end this paragraph with a kind of oddly ominous sentence, this is church, period. Now, for kind of any definition, you can see how some of these words would fit in: congregation, penance, deliverance, meditative. Like it's very much about the experience. They're kind of describing a religious experience. And under my definition of religion, which is something that is both communal and transcendent, something that kind of provokes some ineffability, this is a kind of a textbook example that we can see with how Tracksmith describes the experience of the long run, that it is kind of done in community, right? We see whether in a group or in solitude, it's a kind of physical communion. There's a congregation of runners that the runner belongs to, whether they're running with someone or not, right? There's a kind of communal aspect to that running, and it's absolutely ineffable. They try to put words to it here, but we get words like hypnotic, meditative, and ultimately the long run for the runner is deliverance. According to Tracksmith. This is ultimately Tracksmith's manifesto about what the experience of running is, and they think it's church. Now, there are a couple examples of things that we looked at in class that can help us, that can help us kind of explain and poke at what Tracksmith is doing here. So the first is when we looked at sports earlier in the class. Now, we looked at it through the lens of the Church of Maradona, which is much more about the experience of watching rather than playing, right? It's the experience of watching Maradona play soccer as a religious experience, and that's absolutely relevant here. I mean, this is a film that is watched. It's a religious experience to watch it. If you do it in community, you just follow the runner, and there's ethereal music playing, and it's a beautiful hour and a half, if you can get through it. But the second and third kind of really get into the nuts and bolts here. The first is that body image connection. We talked about it in class, but we also talked about it with Edgley's work, that he surveyed that's a potential motivation for people to run. And we've looked at how body image can become a religion and can function as a religion. That we get the idealization of a body type, right? We see that with runners, the thin and fit runner. And then there's a ritual, that's running. And on a long run, on a weekly long run that happens on Sunday, we can see how that same ritual aspect of a body image gets played out. The third one is, I think, the most prevalent, and that's marketing. Now, we looked at marketing with regard to the evangelical industrial complex, to pastors that are selling and how they market themselves and their products. But, those pastors are not just selling products, they're selling experiences. And the same is true of Tracksmith. Tracksmith is not just selling running clothing and running shoes and accessories, they're selling an experience. And that is what is shown, and that's what's shown in this film. Now, if we take a step back, Tracksmith is what we could consider a secular company, right? They make no explicit mention of God. They've got nothing about Christ. They're not explicitly Christian. The language in the article describing the film, describing the experience of running, is inflected through, Christianity. But it's not just the film for Tracksmith, right? They're selling a real world experience, and we can see that here. So this is the Church of the Long Run in Boston. It is a weekly meetup held at the Tracksmith store. It's going to happen on Sunday, right after I turn this in, where people in Boston will come to the track house at 285 Newbury Street. They will get some coffee, some bananas, some communion, if you will, and then they'll go off on a 15-mile route. And the same words, that Tracksmith writes in this article about the film, congregation, penance, altar, meditative, deliverance, church, are lived out in these weekly meetings. The experience of Tracksmith is this, and what they're selling. The experience of Tracksmith that they're selling is church. And what this tells us is twofold. And they're kind of what we can say about two groups. So, we can say this about Tracksmith, and we can say about the audience that Tracksmith is speaking to, which is that this language, this kind of Christian inflected language, church, congregation, communion, penance, altar, deliverance, that resonates. That means something. And that language, those words represent the tracksmith experience. Now, this opens up a couple other questions that religion scholars can, consider down the road, which, the obvious ones are kind of what happens if we sub out that language, that kind of Christian and inflected language, for the language of another religious group. What happens if this isn't the church or the synagogue on Sundays? What happens if it's the synagogue of the long run on Sunday? Sorry, the church of the long run for the synagogue of the long run. Why, if we kind of look at how this project would change as a result of other language being brought in that isn't inflected through Christianity in the same way, how does that change both Tracksmith's project, the film, and how they live out the values of that film, how they live out the experience of that film in meetings like this? Because ultimately, what Tracksmith is doing with the project and is doing with the Church of the Long Run in Boston on Sunday is selling an experience. And how they go about marketing that experience to consumers using religious language raises a lot of questions for religion scholars to consider.